Hello, and thank you for watching this Q&A for Cane Fire. My name is Josh Martin, and I'm a programmer for the Austin Asian American Film Festival. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the film's director, Anthony Banua-Simon. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
I'd first just like to start with a little bit about your background. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that this is your first feature, but it's definitely not your first film. Is that
first feature? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, what kind of films did you make before this, and were they kind of a piece with this? Did they lead into this in some way?
Yeah, I feel like what I did before was all kind of small pieces of this, and some of the shorter films I was doing before were kind of in preparation for this project, different aspects of that. For example, with a film I did, a short documentary I did called Third Shift, I did with Mike Vass, who's the co-writer and co-producer of Cane Fire. We just got into it because we were at a collaborative studio in Brooklyn, and we were interested in this sugar refinery that had went out of business, and we were talking to former workers there, and we learned about this era of industrial labor in Williamsburg, which is now very expensive real estate, that this used to be a place where there was a big sugar refinery and industrial work and garment district. And we learned about the union involvement there. There was a long strike there, probably the longest in New York's history. So getting to know that and getting to know the history of the sugar trade, larger in a global scale, how it connected to my great-great-grandmother in Puerto Rico, to my family in Hawaii, what I would find later. But it was through my research about the sugar trade that brought me to Hawaii. So that was one of the pieces. Another short was called Pure Flicks and Chill. It was kind of a satirical found footage piece about Christian cinema, like a big figure in Christian cinema, and only using films that this actor would star in, as he kind of self-narrated his own story. So that was kind of a way of figuring out how to repurpose blockbuster films and kind of rework them, because I was working on that while I was working on Cane Fire, which is looking at other Hollywood films shot on Hawaii. So it was those kind of two things that definitely informed Cane Fire.
So so you didn't come to the story one way or the other? Like, it sounds like this was kind of developed in parallel, like, because these are not like completely separate pieces. They're very well integrated, but you have kind of the film piece, the Hollywood version of history, and then you have the authentic history, I suppose, the history of what was going on behind the scenes, behind that footage. So was it sort of a situation where you kind of came to one through the other, or was it more of this like a parallel development in that sense?
Yeah, it was with just the Hollywood aspect for Hawaii. It was first an experiment of watching every film shot on Kauai and thinking chronologically, this parallel history that was going on to the material history that was involving my family. And, it wasn't, at first it was looking at it in just a particular way of like the different industries that would kind of creep their way in, how the sugar and pineapple industry was shown in Hollywood, and then the tourist industry. And that was only a starting point. And then it was going further into the stories of like, what were the actual ideologies pushing these films, from the perspective of the sugar industry, from the perspective of the US military, building this idea of statehood. That came later, I would say. So it was this thing that was kind of growing on one end. And then when I would have these conversations with people, these oral histories, you wouldn't know, but suddenly they would comment on this Hollywood history, and it'd be this conversation back and forth, very unexpected, and we would just go with it. So we really weren't expecting or forcing a particular conversation. I mean, I guess the initial entry, the easiest way that we entered the Cane Fire was this lost film and trying to find this lost film. It's a great conversation starter where it's like, oh, did you know about this? And then you can also talk about this era in plantation history and Hollywood at the same time, and families. So it was like an entry point. And there are more people that aren't in the film that are actively looking for it, and really did take to the question, is this mystery.
So what was the kind of timeline of this project? Because we see, I know there's some footage that is kind of dated. There's, I think, you have an interview with Chad Deal where he says it's 2015, but then we see
Yeah.
events that are happening a little bit more recently.
Yeah.
So what was there like a certain components that you kind of started out with, and then what kind of came later as you kind of kept going and kept
Yeah,
adding
that's a good
on?
question. It was like, it was a self-funded, whenever I had time kind of project. So, I was working freelance in New York, and whenever I had time in my schedule to go to Hawaii for a certain amount of time and film, continue to film on the project, I would. It probably ended up being about, if it was back to back, it was probably about 7 months worth of filming over a 6-year period. So it started in 2014, as early as 2014, going over there initially. And it was always just me and a camera. And then I would come back to New York and talk about it with Mike, and we would look through the footage and, kind of process what was going on. But it was very much a solo expedition. And, these themes always followed me, but I just didn't know exactly how they were going to be addressed. It was really just following these different trails and, many different interviews before it came to the finished film. I think the entry point was through my great uncle Henry, where coming off of researching sugar history and labor history and about the unions, that was like my initial pull, like thinking about my great grandfather and thinking about organization. And, I knew that there was a different relationship to the, Native Hawaiian population, the sovereignty movement, but I didn't know how to integrate it. Like, it was, other than just being kind of a historical note, but to actively have that conflict in the film didn't really come until the Coco Palms occupation, where you're actually seeing these different perspectives in conversation with one another in a way that I had never seen before or could have anticipated, because I had filmed at Coco Palms from the point of view of this kitschy hotel point of view first, before I even met with the activists that came after. And so it kind of all came together afterwards. So it was really hard to predict, but that's kind of how it came together.
One of the things, and you mentioned the activists who are working to rehabilitate or reclaim the Coco Palms, the former Coco Palms development. One of the things that's very striking is the extent to which not just them, but most of the people that you interview, that you encounter in the film, are very open, very willing to share, including people who are on, say, a different side of the issue, and I think it's fair to say a different side from you, or a different perspective, sure. Certainly. How do you gain that trust? How did you kind of, especially with the activists who are having to worry about law enforcement and somebody bringing the hammer down? How do you work? How do you earn that trust as a filmmaker?
Yeah, it is different with who I talk to. It's with family, there's much more trust, and if it's from the sugar and pineapple era, and this is talking about things in the past. But when you talk to people that things are ongoing, and like you say, there's court cases and National Guard involved. With the activists, I approached them completely different than anyone else, because I knew that they were in the middle of an action that weren't necessarily going to spend too much time with me in pursuit of my film, because my film was commenting on aspects of it, but it wasn't a complete advocacy piece for them. So what I did with them is I made it really clear, like, what my interests were, how I felt it tied into the project, and they were really open to it. Now, Kayala especially, we probably spent a good 2 hours when we first met, just talking about every association, connection, and she really connected to it. And then my offer to them was, whatever I shot, I would give to them afterwards to use however they wanted to. If they wanted to make a more straightforward, advocacy piece about their claim to the land, they talk about these things in some of the interviews, but I might not, they might not connect to the overall thesis of my film, or it might not be as relevant to me. And so that was the deal we worked off of. But unfortunately, as you see, because of the project dissolved, we weren't able to follow up. Like I wasn't able to make that happen because they got evicted. I mean, maybe if there's another wind, if they get back together, I know a lot of them disperse. Like there's a possibility for that, but it's very much, if you're familiar with the protests at Mauna Kea, a lot of the filmmakers would just film and then they would put it all in one directory, and people would make films from this one single source of footage. And so that was with them, and it felt comfortable. You know, it was clear, you know, what was sensitive and what was kind of off off limits. You know, they didn't speak to things that were sensitive to the case. But with the other group, when I'm talking to, you know, Chad Deal, real estate, and Mike Faya, the sugar descendant. With Mike Faya, I think he hadn't had these kind of conversations in a long time, and I think he really actually enjoyed speaking to these things in a frank way. I don't think he felt overly defensive. I think that he's very strong in his convictions, and I think that he just feels kind of secure in his place. I'm not sure what, you know, again, with him, I was upfront about what my interests were, my point of view was. Yeah, different ways of explaining things, but that kind of made for an interesting, kind of a tense conversation because he didn't know exactly, you know, it's just there on the spot. Very long conversation with Chad Deal. You know, again, wasn't my goal to like shame individuals, like, or, you know, it was more kind of, I saw people were speaking to larger ideas, and then with him being the board of realtors, like, thought that he would speak to that or be conscious of that, but he was, you know, it was a little bit more of a defensive conversation than I anticipated. But, you know, I just let him speak. And, you know, again, I disagree. You know, I think he's speaking to these like very larger problematic things, and, you know, but I'm not shaming him as an individual. I just see him as a part of it, you know, part of the conversation, I guess. But I'm not sure. Yeah. How they, I'm not sure how they actually, I have not talked to them about it, so I don't know how they felt, if they were well represented, or if they, you know, if they thought that was, yeah, I don't know. I think with different groups, it's like, you know, with people that I'm speaking to that I know that aren't able to represent themselves, you know, in this power dynamic, I'm very, very conscious of like making sure they're well represented and that their concerns are addressed. I think with groups that, you know, I feel have more power between my family, you know, almost like punching up in a way, I think it's okay to engage in this way and make people uncomfortable. You know, it's not going to be devastating for them, and it might be uncomfortable, but you know, I don't see it as detrimental to them. You know, they still have the same, you know, dynamic.
I mean, like the real estate industry can, you know, represent itself. We see, you know, they have a whole apparatus of, you know,
Right.
advertising films, you know, promotional films, and you show some of those, and they are, of course, completely different from the film that we're watching. But I did. I'm glad you mentioned the Mauna Kea protests and the kind of collective filmmaking effort there, because you show excerpts from a lot of films, and when they do have a name, you identify, you know, the film, you know, there's a little thing in the corner of the film of the year, and these are, you know, very generally Hollywood films. But you have there's one particular film that is excerpted, which is very different from those, about the Waimanalo evictions in 1985.
Yes.
And I found that kind of striking, just as an example, you know, a much earlier example of a more, I guess one could say, politically engaged, or in that case, a activist Hawaiian cinema. And I was just kind of curious if you would be, you know, willing to kind of share for the audience, maybe if people were more interested in seeing films kind of covering that side of Hawaiian history, as opposed to just what we're getting from the Elvis movies. Like, what kind of history does Hawaii have, or the cinema of Hawaii have in that in that sense.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that film in particular, and that's one of the few pieces of archive where it's, we're not commenting on it. We're very much using it as a first-hand source. It's part of telling the story, and so we're very conscious with the filmmaker. The filmmaker is Joan Lander and her partner Pui Pao. Pui Pao passed on, but Joan Lander is still very much active. She lives on the Big Island in Hawaii, and her and Pui Pao have made just numerous political documentaries about Native Hawaiian issues, and they're really essential. Most of them are available on Vimeo, and a few are actually on the Criterion channel, I think, still. And yeah, that was such a powerful piece. And, we talked to her about it, how it was going to be used, because, it's its own thing. It's not us commenting on it. So it was kind of out of the normal, and being able to license it properly, compensate her properly, because, this is very, researched and work that they're doing, and being able to honor that. Yeah, Waimanalo, and that they've done like a longer historical documentary about how the overthrow, more detailed explanation of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, a longer film about Mauna Kea. It's about 2005. So that's, this has been going on for a long time. I know in some circles it seems like a new thing, but it's been definitely ongoing. Yeah, I would fully encourage seeking out their work, and I want to bring more of their work out, because not only do they have so many films in this, at least, let's see, 50-year span, but they have a huge archive of things that aren't even completed, that they have just shooting so many housing evictions, music performances, marches, protests. Yeah, I think it's really powerful work, and I'm glad and really honored that Joan Lander was willing to let us use that clip for the documentary.
Just to kind of take it a little bit back to the Hollywood piece, you very clearly watched and perhaps to some extent suffered through a huge number of films, Hollywood films about Hawaii, filmed on Kauai. Is there one that you would say gets it maybe the most right, or at least the least wrong? Is there anything that you would say maybe in its depiction of Hawaii or Kauai does better than the average?
It's too bad. I mean, I wish I could say yes. I mean, in this, as a Hollywood blockbuster, I'd say no. I mean, there's so many amazing Hawaiian filmmakers that I could easily point to. And again, I think a recent showcase on the Criterion channel is really good, showing some of those filmmakers. As for large budget, I really don't, a lot of people point to The Descendants as kind of being the closest, and, with George Clooney, the Alexander Payne film. And, that one's okay. I think what still kind of follows these films is it's still the kind of white savior point of view, and that he is the, everything is an antagonist to him and his kind of concerns and his white guilt of having inherited all this land. And that's kind of the comedic tension of it. And, that's been going on for so long in all these films, that it's so similar to even Charlton Heston's Diamond Head from 1960. It's the same, this anti-hero that we're supposed to, be interested in their arc. Charlton Heston is stubborn about moving from being a head of a plantation into statehood, and has issues with his sister dating someone who's half Hawaiian. It's I'm all for, I can appreciate anti-heroes. I'm a fan of The Sopranos, so I don't think everything should be a showcase of just good behavior and moral decisions. But Yeah, there's something that doesn't quite hit the mark with any of those. I feel like it was harder to encapsulate that era of starting in the 90s and the 2000s of what those films were like, because during the Cold War, during World War II, like it was fighting, this fight of supporting military and supporting, anti-communist messages is very overt. And then you're in this era that's kind of this phase of almost kind of a victory lap where it's the war has been won, and now Hawaii becomes more of a backdrop in this era. And so this era of like 80s 90s era where it's less that they even talk about what's going on in Hawaii during this time,
like 6 days
earlier,
seven
like
nights or something, where it's just like
exactly.
people on vacation or something.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what because it's, even if in that previous era, even if it was always on the side of the companies or the the US, at least it kind of entertained that there was a tension, but it's almost completely just washed, like it doesn't exist through the span. Like there's no war to fight in that kind of ideological battle. So
Right.
I think that's where Descendants comes kind of into, and it kind of pokes and prods at different things, but it's just kind of doesn't quite hit the mark, I think.
So just to close this out, are there any updates on the people or the events that we see in the film? I know there's been some stuff that happened with the Coco Palms redevelopment, and then of course you mentioned the Mauna Kea activism around that, and I don't know if that involves any of the people that we see in this film, or whatever they're up to.
Yeah, well, Coco Palms, particularly the owners that you see, Chad Waters, and was it Chad Waters and Tyler Green? They defaulted on their loan. I mean, that whole project just fell apart, and it's really unfortunate because they kicked everyone off, and people that were trying to build and grow taro and settle there were kicked out, and now it's a vacant space again. So it's all just back to square one. There's really even no reason to vacate people because there's no hotel being built right now. I think there's a plan. There's already a new investor, and they have some ideas, but it has been interesting the last 5 years that more people that live on the island are more interested in having a cultural center versus a hotel, which hasn't been the case for a while. I mean, who controls it is one thing, but just that they're thinking in that way, that maybe this golden era, like this nostalgia, can just be left behind. This Elvis period, like maybe we can move on from that.
It's like someone says in the film.
So it's kind of
like someone says in the film, one of the activists, Elvis is dead. The Coco Palms has been a ruin for 20 years. It's time to look for something else.
It's exactly. Yeah. So I think that's been more the consensus than it has been before, but we'll see. Yeah. I mean, COVID has changed put every kind of plan on hold, but that's where it's at right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. And this is a really great film. We're very excited to be showing it, and I'm sure our audience will be excited to see it. And we're looking forward to whatever comes next.
Cool. All right. Thanks for having me.